The Shape of Things is the example of a play that we'll be looking at this term. It's our only dramatic text. When I say dramatic, I mean it was meant to be a play. It was meant to be performed. And it's a contemporary text. It was written 2001, I think, or 2000. And it's remarkably accessible. It's, there's only four characters. There's two, a guy and a girl. They meet each other and they get together, and then it seems to go well, and then doesn't. It's a great example of a tragedy, in fact, it's a great example, it's a contemporary example of a really old and very formalized kind of play. When we talk about the history of drama or theater, we go all the way back to the Greeks, and some very first performances, and in classical Greece, they had two big genres. They were comedies, which weren't so much that they were funny, but comedies ended happily. They often talked about relationships, and comedies had happy endings. The other genre of theater, of drama, of performance were tragedies. And tragedies weren't just sad, but tragedies were moralistic. And they had several elements. And I'm going to go over these very quickly, the classical elements of Greek tragedy, because when you know them and as you watch The Shape of Things, you'll see that as contemporary as The Shape of Things is, it's actually following a very classical, step-by-step tragic form. So in a classical tragedy, in classical Greek drama, a tragedy had several important parts. First, there was a prologue, a beginning that sort of told us where we were, set the scene, and actually foreshadowed all the themes of the piece. After the prologue, the plot develops. We have 2, 3, 4 acts of plot development. Stuff happens. The characters do things. And then after a bunch of stuff has been done, after the story has been told a little bit, there is an event, an eruption, a disruption, a climax. Ba-boom! And in Greek tragedies, you know when they're happening. And in The Shape of Things, you also know when it's happening. The climax comes near the end of the play when Evelyn gets to stand up in front and tell us about her thesis project. What a surprise. And you will be sitting on the edge of your seat going, whoa, no, what's... Well, you'll have hints that something's going on, but boy, will you be surprised when you find out what's really going on. And the text explodes, or rather, the audience explodes. And what the audience explodes with in a classical Greek tragedy is a catharsis. We go, oh my God, no! Oh, she didn't! And that sense, that emotional explosion that's evoked in the audience is on purpose, it's by design. And the Greeks thought it was a purging. The Greeks thought we need tragic dramas so that the audience would go, oh no! And that when we have those tears and those shrieks and that, oh my God, I can't believe this, that's letting these toxic, bad feelings out by the citizenry. It gives us a chance, a therapeutic, like a good cry that lets us let go of these issues. So catharsis, the cathartic act at the climax of a Greek drama, of a Greek tragedy, has a civic purpose, a healing purpose even, if you will. So that's one of the great gifts of the morality play that are tragedies. And then after the climax, after the audience shrieks, cries, and fear and trembles, then there's the last piece is a wrapping up of the play. We call that the denouement, the sort of wrapping up and moving on beyond, so that we can take a breath and leave the theater and go on with our lives. hopefully purged, hopefully taught, hopefully a little more at balance with the world. So there were some great tragedians. Euripides is one. Who else wrote great tragedies? Aeschylus wrote great tragedies. And so you can dip back into that treasure, and I hope some of you will in your later study. But for our purposes, we're in this very contemporary college campus world of Adam and Evelyn, and they're falling in love, or so it appears. And I just want to give you a little hint of the play and a little hint of how tragedies work, which is to say, if you look at the very first part of your text, you can read this. I have pieces of the script online, and again, you might keep this in your mind as you're watching, whether you watch hopefully the Rachel Weisz and Paul Rudd, if you can get access through Stars to get it on your video, or you can watch the NYU student version. There's two versions you can access. That one's free and you can just click. The Paul Rudd one's a little trickier to get a hold of, but do if you can. It's really worth it. So we have the beginning of this text, and I guess I want to say really quickly why I can't hear too. I also threw out the story of Pygmalion. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the next video, but Pygmalion is about a sculptor and a statue. It's about an artist and the artist's work. And here we land in this college museum with another artist, Evelyn. Evelyn is herself an artist. And we have this giant Fornicelli, this huge, beautiful classical sculpture in the very first scene. So here's how the playwright writes it. It's silence, it's dark. A young woman stands near a stretch of velvet rope. She has a can in one hand and stares up at an enormous human sculpture. After a moment, a young man in uniform appears, steps across the barrier, and approaches her. So you've got a little barrier, and someone is stepping across. And here's the opening salvo, the opening lines of the play. It starts with Adam. Adam, you stepped over the line, miss. You stepped over. Evelyn, I know. It's Ms. Okay, sorry, miss, but I meant to. Step over. What? Yeah, I figured you did. I mean, the way you did it all kind of deliberate, like you're not supposed to do that. I know. That's why I tried it. Why? To see what would happen. Oh, well, me, I suppose. Me? No, I mean, I'm what happens. I guess I have to walk over like I've done, and you have to take a step back. Could you please step back? And if someone doesn't, what then? You're not going to step back? No, I mean, yes, I probably will, but just for interest's sake, what would you do if, I'm not sure, I've never had anyone not step back. I've only said it like 4 times, and every time they've stepped back. What if I'm your first non-stepper, I mean? Then what? Now, the text goes on, and I've already told you this is a tragedy. This is a morality play. It's about wrongdoing. It's about boundaries being violated, boundaries being transgressed. It's about people who you won't believe the lines they've crossed. Lines of good behavior, lines of right behavior, lines of fairness, lines of morality, lines of make-believe, and the real world. All kinds of boundaries are transgressed, are stepped over, are violated and disrupted in this play. And keep that in mind as you're watching and then later as you're reading. And please notice that in these very first lines, we have a great example of a prologue. We have this acting out of somebody crossing a boundary, of somebody breaking a rule. And we have this encounter of man and woman. It's not Miss, it's Ms. We have some kind of gender politics being introduced, if even just a little bit. We have some kind of, when I do bad, what will happen? This notion of what's the consequences for my actions? Who's going to enforce it? And it's interesting to see what happens when we break rules. Like, what happens if I don't do X, Y, Z, or PDQ? What happens if let's test it. Let's test things. Let's see how far we can go. Let's step over the line. So all these themes, that's what foreshadowing is, a dramatic representation that sort of evokes all kinds of themes that we might be looking at and considering and exploring later in the play. So there's a nice little introduction to Greek tragedy, its parts, prologue, development, climax. There's a little talk about catharsis, emotional blowing up, emotional expression, feelings evoked in the audience, and denouement, the wrap up. And so keep these in mind, this contemporary, popular, easy to follow play, and how interesting that it follows a very old, very classical, and very specific organizational development of classical Greek tragedy. See you next time.